Hi everyone, I'm Massa, a reporter at Bloomberg News, and today we're going to be looking at the trends driving demand for responsible investing. Responsible investing strategies are enjoying a lot of attention recently and are expected to see double-digit growth in the years ahead. So we want to really drill into that and look at what's behind some of the demand for those opportunities. And people are also voting more with their dollars in the products they buy and what they demand from their corporate employers as well. So we'll look at that too. With me here today, I have Josh Zinner, CEO of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, David Heath, CEO of Bombas, which has a one-for-one program donating one pair of socks to someone in need for every pair sold. And I'd like to welcome back Daniela Pierre, who's a producer at NBC Universal, as you know already. So let's kick off with a polling question. So the question is, what is currently the biggest trend in responsible investing? And that will go up on your app right now. Employee activism, corporate purpose, or faith-based value investing? Corporate purpose pulling ahead. Employee activism is behind right now. Corporate purpose seems to be the overwhelming choice from our audience here so far. So, Josh, can you start us off by talking, bouncing off of that idea of corporate purpose? How have we gotten here, and what has changed over time since you came to ICCR? How have we gotten to a point where corporate purpose is so much more important?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start by talking briefly about kind of the founding of ICCR. ICCR has been around for 50 years now, and started when a group of faith-based investors began engaging with companies about the business that they were doing in apartheid South Africa. And really through that process, long before there was ESG, members of ICCR founded this strategy of shareholder engagement on environmental and social issues and governance issues. And so obviously we're in a very different world now. During that time, there was a slow, for many years, ICCR members were kind of canaries in the coal mine, or gadflies, bringing issues to companies that most investors weren't touching, and really trying to talk to companies and kind of raise awareness about issues like forced labor and global supply chains and climate risk long before that discussion was, became mainstream. And in time, there's been a growing understanding, and it's really been accelerated in the past, 10 years, I would say, especially, but a gradual growing understanding that environmental, social, and governance issues, that it's not just about doing good, that this is about, or what's good for the planet, although obviously those coincide. It's really fundamentally for investors and increasingly for companies about good business, right? And so there's a growing realization that companies that understand what their risks are, whether it's risks around human rights risks in their supply chains, or climate risk, or good governance issues, chair CEO split, director votes, whatever it might be, that these are really transparency, that these are really fundamental towards long-term value. And yeah, so I just, in close, so the message that ICCR members were bringing to companies for so many years, that companies that are looking, that are talking to all stakeholders and really focused on the impacts on key stakeholders, and also focused on building long-term value and understanding their environmental and social impacts and good governance, are really companies that are building value over the long term. And I think that conversation has been more and more mainstreamed, and so now there's a broad understanding that those are the strongest companies that are really leaders in that area.
Sure, and keying off of that point, David, can you talk to us a little bit about how you've experienced the growth in consumer awareness of good business practices?
Yeah, so, I think I always say Newman's Own was kind of the first consumer-facing, socially responsible company, and then obviously you had Patagonia, which kind of came out, but Tom's was really the one, I think, to make a really big headline splash about, this is our business, right? It's doing some good. Shortly followed by Warby, and then us. And so I think that what we've seen over the years is an increase in companies coming out and trying to have some sort of social mission pegged to whatever it is that they do, whether it's something to do with reducing plastics in the supply chain or giving back to, part of the ecosystem under which they, source their products. We've definitely seen a massive, massive increase. It's almost become somewhat table stakes, more so in consumer than I think, tech, it's a little bit harder, but a lot of the consumer brands that I've seen kind of, flow through over the years have definitely, they've either had a mission or said, we want to have something that's kind of bigger than just selling a product.
And how do consumers ferret out who has been there in the arena with a responsible strategy versus who hopped on a fad?
Yeah, I mean, the consumer, I think, is pretty good at understanding authenticity. One of the things that I tell a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs is don't just tack something on because you feel like you need to do it, right? Try to get as close to the issue as possible. So for us, when I read the quote that socks were the most requested clothing item at homeless shelters, I wasn't like, oh my God, there's a business here. I'm going to go solve this. I started carrying socks around in my backpack, and on my way to and from work, I started handing them out and seeing the firsthand reactions of people being like, oh my God, how did you know this is what I needed? And that really validated, the idea of kind of building upon that. I advised for a coconut ice cream company, and she was like, look, I really want to incorporate some sort of a social mission, but I don't know how to do it. We could donate food, we could do something. I was like, well, why don't you look at your supply chain and, see if there's a way to kind of give back? Because I imagine, just from what I understand about the coconut farming industry, is that, it's typically done in, pretty poor countries. And the people who are doing it, it's very low cost manual labor. And so she ended up going down and visiting the coconut farmers and realized that the thing that they cared most about was earning enough money to invest in education for their children. And so now she donates a percentage of her profits back to the coconut farmers, specifically for education for the younger generation. And that becomes a really engaging and, interesting and authentic story for the consumer to relate to, because it ties really nicely with, what it is that she's selling. If you're just simply okay, we sell clothing, we're going to do 1% for the planet, it's nice, but the consumer wants to see what the tie-in and wants to see how you close the loop for them from a brand and creative perspective.
So you need something that's sort of a natural fit.
Yes.
On the employee side, Daniela, can you talk a little bit about how employees are demanding more from their actual employers and how companies are really responding to that, like at NBC?
Yeah, well, I can talk on what we found in the book. It's this idea of, especially when you talk about impatience, right? That's very closely correlated with, how people see Gen Z and millennials. And instead of looking at it as impatience, there's a way where employers can engage that thought as a sense of urgency, because there is a misconnect. So when somebody says that they're impatient about their career, a different way of saying it would be to say, I just want to see the track, right? So it's like, I know I'm at the bottom of the totem pole, or maybe you're in a manager position trying to get to the next step. If you don't see or just if somebody doesn't explain that sort of path for you, is I think when young people start tuning out. And when we're talking about, aligning with social and corporate missions, I think there's a core value there that needs to be aligned as well. And just going back to your point, I think that one of the ways that is very clear on consumers kind of brushing away companies that say they want to do social good is the difference between how the sauce is made, is how you explain, and marketing tactics. I'm sorry if anybody works for Pepsi here, but that's one of the first things that comes to mind. Somebody that wanted to insert themselves in a relevant social conversation with the Kylie Jenner, for example, commercial that went totally awry, as we know. So I think that there is a difference between, standing for something that is socially good and actually embedding into the core values and how you operate in business. And I think that especially Gen Z has become more skeptical in that sense.
And are you, oh, sure, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of add to that, so, as investors, we've had conversations. We don't talk to the Bombas so much as we talk to the big multinational corporations that have very broad impacts, some negative, some positive. And really, we have to, in order to have a productive conversation that moves that company, we have to make the case about business risk and opportunity. And one thing that has made that case a lot easier to make through the years has been the obvious sort of clear demand amongst particularly younger consumers for ethical products, and also low tolerance for bad practices. And also employee activism. It's the same thing, particularly in conversations, say, with the tech industry about human rights, for example. That's one of the core arguments in terms of making a business case as investors and understanding where the risk and opportunity is the fact that tech employees are concerned about the use of facial recognition technology and surveillance or whatever the issue might be. And so those trends are going hand in hand, I think, with the ability of investors to make a compelling case to companies about being diligent on environmental, social, and governance issues.
And do you think that a large company is disqualified from the conversation? How does a large company go about approaching some of those issues in an authentic way, would you say?
I think you tap into your employee base. I think that's a missed opportunity. I think when you're at the bottom of the totem pole, again, in middle management positions, there's so much knowledge capital there that can just be, the bridges can kind of shut if we just ask for transparency. And by that, I mean is, people at the top of corporations to be able to listen to their employee base, who spend hundreds and thousands of dollars, I don't know how much, on focus groups outside of the company to see how things would, resonate with consumers. And, so much of the resources are internally. You just got to tap into them. I had this conversation with Kathy Engelbert of Deloitte, who we interviewed for the book, and it's this requirement, not even a need. It's this requirement that young people have now that are asking for leaders in their corporations to show transparency. And I think that is a way where you can really engage your workforce to come up with a product that is, going to come out well received, and it's going to resonate with the audience that you intended it for.
Sure. Even given some of that increased demand, David, do you find that there are big challenges that you face as you try to incorporate sustainability into your whole business model and ethos?
Yeah, I mean, the first aspect is defining sustainability, right? It's not a binary outcome, right? There's multiple variations of what is sustainability. Is it, just using, like we're working towards, our first effort is working towards factories that, run off of renewable energies, right? But then, you go one level deeper, and then it's going to the supply chain of like, where do we source the cotton from? And, how are those processes? And then are we not sustainable if we ship our products over on a ship that uses diesel, right? Like, so there's so many layers. And I think ultimately what the biggest challenge is actually setting out what your long-term goal is and making it somewhat reasonable. And I think that's why so many companies are pegging it out, 10 years. This is not something that you can just flip the switch overnight and remove plastic immediately from every aspect of your supply chain, or, go entirely, carbon neutral on your shipping. And, it is a process that you need to, implement over the years, because, these things are big, right? And so really getting in at the core of defining what each of these things means for you as your organization, and then, again, being transparent about it, both with your employees and then the consumers, and making sure everybody is on board for kind of, the plan that you're about to put into place.
And just adding on to that is, in your earlier question sort of about accountability for the larger corporations, it's really, really important that they have processes in place and that they're not just greenwashing. One example of an important process is a human rights due diligence process under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which are just from 2011 and which create a standard of responsibility for businesses to respect human rights in their operations and supply chains. So part of that process is doing a human rights impact assessment, talking to key stakeholders. And so it's really, really important that companies are interacting with stakeholders, whether it's impacted communities, employees, or consumers and others, to really understand what their most salient impacts are, so that they can address them and put in place mechanisms to mitigate risk, and also to become leaders in putting in place meaningful processes to avoid these problems. So it's having processes in place and really robust engagement with stakeholders is really, really important.
Yeah, on that front, we partner with an organization called Made in a Free World, and all of our factory partners need to be Made in a Free World certified, and that's what that does is basically say that they agree to open up their supply chain and their kind of factories for the outside scrutiny of a third party to go in and verify that they're working with like everything out from a human rights aspect and make sure there's no child labor or forced labor. But again, it's making sure that as a smaller organization like us, like we can't afford to have a department regulated to that. So trying to find ways in which you can incorporate that in an efficient way is really important.
So it sounds like you really have to both prioritize, find out what your priorities are, and then figure out the process by which you're going to implement it. And that may require bringing in outside help if you're a smaller organization.
And also tabling things. Like you have to be, you have to understand, especially for the startups in the world, right? Like you can't do all these things immediately out of the gate on day one. Like we had no sustainability practice, or really guidelines for the first, 5 years, because we were just trying to get profitable, right? And it's not to say that we didn't, choose factories that, tried to use recycled goods or, have their own dye houses where they recycled the water and were, as, that weren't doing necessarily direct harm, but also not one where we set it as such a huge priority that we were willing to take margin out of our business in a business when we were just trying to kind of stay alive. So, we chose the route of like, okay, let's give back to the communities in which we live in and, have an impact, through the giving aspect of our brand. And then as we get bigger and we generate more cash flow, then we can start to tackle on all of these other issues that are important to consumers.
Yeah.
And for big companies, it's really critical that they do an analysis of what are the most salient issues. So what of their impacts have the most severe detrimental impact on people and communities, and then cross-reference that with where do they have the most influence.
Definitely.
Whether over supply chains or direct operations, so that they're not getting at kind of side issues, but really at the core issues where they're having the most severe impact.
And Daniela, why do you think that millennials are more interested in working for companies that are doing that work?
I think I touched on this a little bit. I think we really have to contextualize the world that we live in, and it's millennials and Gen Z. I keep saying we, but it's millennials and Gen Z. Contextualizing the world of the recession that we grew up with, right? We saw our parents lose their jobs and go through home foreclosures. Older millennials came into the workplace paying, tons of student debt and not able to find jobs still. And I think it's a frustration also with Washington, that we've kind of looked towards business leader for answers, whether it's gun reform or climate change, things that really aren't moving the needle, and that we're seeing like with a lot of consequences right in front of our faces. So again, I think it's just a realization that our world, our society, our country has sort of hit a breaking point, and it's like if you have dedicated 4 years and are super in debt and have seen the chaos around you, if you don't work for a purpose, then what are you doing? So I think it's really embedded into the lived experiences of millennials and Gen Z.
And so these might be two generations that are looking increasingly to business leaders to pay attention to these sorts of things, not just politicians.
Yeah, and it's a tricky line for you guys in terms of making a stance, right? Because I think that, because there's that gridlock there in politics, People are looking for answers for leaders elsewhere, and that means business. But stances nowadays, everything's so polarized that you've got to be careful where you draw the line. But people are increasingly becoming more, how would you say it, not okay with leaders not taking a stance. Like, you have to define yourself one way or another.
Right. You can't just float.
And I'd argue that while I think the Millennials and Gen Zers are probably the most vocal about wanting to either work for a company with purpose or buy products from a company with a purpose, we have 130 employees, and they kind of span all the age ranges up until about 60 years old. And we've been in business for 6 years. We've had only 4 people voluntarily leave the organization, and a large part of that is because we do giving events. Not only obviously do people understand that we just donated our 25 millionth pair of socks, and like that is great, and they could go out and tell their friends that, but like we get them close to it, right? So we do 15 giving events here in New York City every single month where people get to go out and interact and help the homeless community. And when you get to tie that together, whether you're 22 years old or 62 years old, when you get to see the direct impact that your job is having on the lives of somebody that literally has nothing, it brings everything into perspective. And all of a sudden, it validates that you're living for something that's bigger than just a paycheck. I don't think that's just unique to Gen Zers or Millennials.
I think you're
anybody
right.
who sees purpose.
Yeah, and that you made a good point about the fact that we're the most vocal, and I think that's because when you grow up as a Millennial or a Gen Zer, your opinion counts.
Right.
And so I think that's what makes a difference, but I totally agree with your sense of working for a purpose.
And seeing a tangible impact.
Yeah, for sure.
And what kinds of shifts do you expect to see in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of demand for more responsibility from companies, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some momentum, and obviously there's headwinds in terms of the policy environment in Washington and accountability. But I think, again, more and more investors and obviously more and more customers and employees are really are pushing for companies to act in a responsible manner. And I think on the investment side, as I said before, I think there's a growing realization that it's well-run companies and companies that are really set up for the long term are companies that are really managing risk and looking for opportunity and building on that. And I think that's an important piece, and you're seeing that in higher and higher shareholder votes for environmental, social, and governance proposals. And despite some unfortunate proposed rules at the SEC right now that are going to make it harder to file shareholder resolutions, I expect that momentum will continue. And just one last thing, I think that a next step is to get really the big investors on board supporting these ideas. And I think instead of just rhetoric, actually really pushing companies on these ideas, whether it's eradicating forced labor and supply chains or climate risk or whatever it might be, to really drive further change. So I think that's the next step. But there is momentum.
David, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, from what we're seeing is we're seeing customers are starting to ask a lot about sustainability. That from the consumer side of things, we're seeing as a really major theme. Internally, from a culture perspective, there's been no topic that has been hotter for us and from every kind of one of these things that I sit on over the last 2-3 years around diversity and inclusion. And so really making sure that, culturally internal, there's a high awareness around diversity across all, genders, races, backgrounds. I mean, what I've come to understand diversity to mean these days is way different than kind of what I thought it was maybe 5 years ago. And then again, the sustainability aspect on the customer front.
And Daniela, what do you think about that? What do you think will be the next wave? How will the conversation evolve around diversity, inclusion, and sustainability over the next decade or so?
Yeah, I mean, I piggyback off what they both said. I think that, looking inside a corporation too is really important, and that diversity what it meant 5 years ago is very different from what it is today. And it's diversity in thoughts, it's diversity in ethnicities and the type of people that you bring in. And I think it's a missed opportunity if leaders don't kind of, lean into that younger workplace and their needs.
I want to pause for questions. If anyone has questions that they'd like to write in through the app, we can take those now.
Thanks, Annie. Let's take some questions. First one for any of you. When implementing sustainability, how do you tackle the issue of short-termism? How about David?
It's really difficult. Like I said, I mean, we've looked around and, there's some easy things in terms of, the way that we ship our products, right? There's, we found out that there was polybags inside of polybags inside of polybags. And so, a simple question was like, how can we reduce the number of polybags, from a plastic waste perspective that we're using? And we were able to kind of cut it down by almost 75%. But really getting into kind of the long-term, the real impact, mostly at the factory level, was where, our head of sourcing said, kind of have the most amount of impact. That's stuff that's like infrastructure changes, right? It's the way in which they utilize energy. It's the way in which they, produce the product. That's a much longer term game. I think short term, you can probably look around the org and make some quick wins here and there, but is it going to move the needle? Probably not that much. It's a better signal to honestly your employees than anybody else to show that like at least you're doing something, because that's the only problem. I mean, that's the biggest problem we've had with kind of the Millennial and Gen Zers is that like they want to see stuff immediately. It's the same thing with diversity and inclusion. It's like as soon as we decided that this was an important topic for us, it's like we can't change our workforce overnight, right? So these are things practices that we have to put into place. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of really big challenges. One is the regulatory landscape. You need to have a regulatory landscape that really supports long-term thinking, whether it's on climate, on health, on income inequality, and unfortunately we're going in the wrong direction there. So that's a big impediment. I think that incentivizes companies towards short-termism. At least those companies that are not smart in thinking long-term. And another challenge is that a lot of investors are universal investors, but they're not thinking that way, right? So these issues that affect portfolios broadly, like climate risk, like income inequality, again, are harder to articulate on a company-by-company basis. But when you look at the whole economy and the impact that has on investors, it's profound. And so that needs to be translated into more aggressive investor pressure across companies and across sectors on these issues that really matter towards the long term. And finally, companies really need to mean it when they talk about it. The Business Roundtable, people in the room I'm sure know, introduced a new statement of corporate purpose at which they are moving away from short-termism, at least in what they're saying, and towards an idea of stakeholder value and long-term value. But in terms of the way that they lobby in Washington and the way that they're treating their employees and other impacts, they're not doing that in practice. And so that needs to change radically. Companies really need to live up to that statement and move in that direction.
Daniela, for you, what about working for companies that are bad to change them? Our questioner wants to know, it's good to work for companies that are good, but is it more valuable for millennials and people who want to drive social change to work for problematic companies and try to change them from the inside?
Well, theoretically, sure. But I think that one of the things that's really important, I think I keep saying millennials and Gen Z, but really anybody is, it's important to feel like you're being purposeful within the organization as well. So if this bad company has an opportunity to grow the person that's in that company, then maybe. I'm trying to think of a bad company.
Monsanto? That's not hard.
Yeah, I don't know. That's I think there's just overall a low threshold on working for companies that are not ethically conscious.
Great.
I'll just add on that. I think the issue is that a lot of going into a bad company, you could say bad company, it's they're driven by core values, right? And ultimately, the leadership is what determines what is important to their organization, right? Like we could decide not to, donate product. We could decide, not to invest in sustainability. We could decide not to invest in, 401ks for our employees and all these other things, and we would be largely more profitable. But we've decided that, we are happier at a lower profit rate as a result. I mean, we're still growing like crazy, and by, industry benchmarks, we're incredibly profitable. But I would say that our growth is now a function of the fact that we've deprioritized that because the customer doesn't care how profitable we are. I mean, our investors and obviously us as business owners, but again, going back to short-termism, we want to build a company that's around for 100 years and longer. So you don't build a company based on trying to chase quarterly or yearly EBITDA, right? You do it over a much longer period of time. And so, again, I think it's much harder to go into some of these places where they've just decided like, no, actually, we don't really give a shit. Profits is like our number one issue. And so we're happy to have environmental impact in the short term and all these other things in order to meet what's important to us as, the leaders of the organization. So it becomes very difficult unless you have the opportunity to go in at a really senior and executive level.
All I can think about is that movie Ides of March. Yeah. No one here know what I'm talking about? Go watch it, then you'll know. Mm-hmm. But it's this idea, I'm sure there's people out there who want to work to make a lot of money, but I think when you talk about longevity and keeping people in the workplace, that's where you're going to lose people.
Right.
This one's directed to Josh. Do you think investors should accept lower returns for socially responsible investments?
So I mean, that's a complicated answer, right? Because there's different kinds of investments, and there's a lot of talk about impact investing and promises that you can, do well and do good and get high returns and still have a social purpose. And there's some truth to that, but there's also some types of investments that truly, if you want to do a community-based investment that is going to benefit low-income communities, you have to take a lower rate. But speaking in terms of investment in public equities, we really believe fundamentally that, again, as I said before, that companies that are really mindful of environmental, social impacts and good governance are actually companies that are building long-term value. That, yes, you could make the argument that in the short term, the returns won't be as high, but these are companies for long-term investors. These are ideas that companies that are really tackling these issues in a meaningful way, not as PR, but in a meaningful way, and identifying risk and identifying opportunity are really companies that are setting up for the long term. So in terms of public equities, there is a win-win there because companies that are really addressing that meaningfully are building value, and there's a lot of data that that's not just our belief. A lot of data that shows that to be true.
So it looks like we're just about out of time. I'd like to thank all of my panelists for this great discussion today. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.